Hi everyone, Rebecca Rhodes here. Today I'll share some tips for painting this puppy in watercolor. This is one of our members' favorite tutorials. It takes about 3 hours to paint and you'll need just a couple paints. Let's get started. In this painting, I'll use Ochre 140-pound cold press watercolor paper, and only 3 colors are needed: Winsor Newton, French Ultramarine Blue, burnt umber or burnt sienna, and yellow ochre. And I encourage you to use your favorite paper, colors, and brushes. You can find links to these materials in the description. I like to begin with the eyes and often the nose and the mouth, taking them almost to completion. I'll begin with a pale gray map of what will be the darker lines and shapes in the eyes. I'm using a gray mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. I'll do the same in the nose. We'll lay in the lightest colors in the eyes and the nose. And then the first layers of brown. And then I'll reinforce what will be the darkest parts using that gray mix of ultramarine blue and burnt umber. This will help us to keep track of where these darker shapes will be. Returning to the eyes, I'm laying in darker values of brown. And in the nose, another layer of gray, laying it in around the lightest parts of the nose. And I'll apply further layers of gray, slowly going darker, creating textures. And you want each layer to dry before applying the next color. Smooth with your slightly damp brush. Reinforce the darkest parts, taking them even darker. The eyes and nose are just about finished, and we'll make further refinements when the surrounding colors are in place. Next, we'll give attention to where the black and brown colors will be. And we'll begin with the lightest color that we can see. I'm applying pale yellow ochre, anywhere that will be black or brown. I'm applying pale color directly to the dry paper, sometimes softening edges if I'd like to see a smooth transition from color into the white of the paper. When that has dried completely, we'll give attention to what will be the black parts, applying a thin layer of gray anywhere that will be black. Again, I'm laying in the color directly to the dry paper, softening edges anytime I'd like to see a smooth transition from color to color. And you want to keep it pale at this point. We're creating a map of colors that we can use as a guide. Here I'm creating the beginnings of the shadow underneath the dog. In this next step, we're going to establish the beginnings of darker values in the tan brown areas. I'm laying in burnt umber where I'd like to see slightly darker browns. It might be to indicate inward curve and bone structure. Darker values help to create the impression that part of a shape is curving away from us. And lighter values make it look like that part of the shape is coming towards us. So you can manipulate values to create the impression of inward and outward curve. We've got the darker browns in place, and things are appearing disjointed. A thin layer of yellow ochre will help to unify the different values, and it will smooth those previous applications just a bit. Do you see how it's taking these shapes a little darker? Next, let's move back to the black parts. I'm feeling like all of the black shapes need to go darker. So I'm applying another pale layer of gray. This represents the lightest value of black. At this point, it's often helpful to focus on a smaller part of the painting, taking it almost to completion. And I'll do that with the ears. I'll use the same gray mix of blue and brown, and this will go even darker. Think of it as the beginnings of what will be the darkest parts. Sometimes you might want to create fur, as I'm doing here. After you've got the darkest parts in place, move to the midtones, values that are not quite as dark. Ask yourself what needs to go a little darker and use a gentle touch. And I'll do the same thing in the other ear, beginning with what will be the darkest parts, then the midtones. When you've got the darkest parts and the midtones in place, you might think that's just not dark enough yet. So you repeat the process. You revisit the darkest parts again, and then the midtones. Use a thicker consistency to go darker, slightly thinner if you don't want to go quite as dark. It often takes more than one layer of color to go darker, and you want to allow each layer to dry before applying the next. When the darks and midtones are in place, you can gently apply another thin layer of gray to take the whole thing darker, to slightly smooth and unify everything. We'll use that same formula from the ears to establish the darker values in the head and the body. I'm looking at the reference photo, asking myself, where are the darkest parts? And I'm using the gray to create those darkest shapes. You might want to lay in fur or thin layers of color. In the forehead, I'm laying in this gray where it will be the darkest, working around the lighter shapes. When painting dark animals, I find that it's necessary to revisit the same areas multiple times. And that's what I'm doing here. I'm going back in, taking those darkest parts even darker with a slightly thicker consistency. This lighter area in the forehead has become too pale. I'll lay in a pale layer of gray to take it a little darker. And when that's dry, I'll lay in some fur, and that will create texture and take that area darker. When you're tired of working on the black parts, revisit the browns. Ask yourself, what needs to go a little darker? Let's stop looking at the head and move into the body, and we'll follow the same process. So let's give attention to the darkest parts, knowing that we will return to take these areas even darker. Apply the color around the shapes that are white or brown, or that you'd like to be lighter in value. Here, I'm going darker along the edge of the body and the legs. I'm thinking that will help to create the impression of inward curve, and we'll come back to it and take it even darker. So around each shape, I'm taking the outer edge of the shape darker. Presently, the values are appearing unbalanced. And next, we'll lay in a slightly thinner consistency of gray over these shapes to take everything a little darker. Let's return to the browns. Does anything need to go a little darker? This is burnt umber. After you reinforce the darker parts, lay in a thin layer of brown to smooth and unify. Let's lay in some texture in the white chest. This is pale gray. I'm creating thin hairs. When you keep the consistency nice and thin, you can create fur while retaining the impression of white. And I'll do a bit of smoothing with plain water and my slightly larger brush. Revisit the shadow area one more time. And there it is. Well, I hope you found this video helpful and applicable to your own paintings. If you'd like to paint this puppy, you can find the entire step-by-step video inside our watercolor membership. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.